Hello and welcome to another episode of our story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Our two main stories today are both in a similar vein. Of course, we'll be continuing to provide updates on the Corps of Discovery led by Lewis and Clark as they make their return journey after wintering in the Pacific Northwest. But we'll also begin telling the story of Zebulon Pike and what will come to be called the Pike Expedition, as another group heads west with a related but slightly different goal. These two main stories will of course be interspersed with other notable events from the year, and will commemorate 3 signers of the Declaration. But as these exploratory missions are some of my favorite to read and write about, the focus will remain westward this year. Welcome to 1806 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and Meriwether Lewis is woken up by gunfire. Reading from the Journal of John Ordway. The party saluted our officers at daybreak this morning by firing at their quarters as a remembrance of the new year. Lewis also writes about the new year, saying, "Our repast of this day, though better than that of Christmas, consisted principally in the anticipation of the first day of January 1807, when in the bosom of our friends we hope to participate in the mirth and hilarity of the day, and when the zest given by the recollection of the present, we shall completely, both mentally and corporally, enjoy the repast which the hand of civilization has prepared for us." Morale is still good in the Corps of Discovery, but it's only human that the men are at this point getting a little homesick, as they've been on this journey for over a year and a half at this point. The winter on the West Coast is continuing to be a challenging one. It's sometimes been icy, sometimes snowy, but nearly always has been rainy. Their journals record no more than 12 sunny days out of their 3 months at Fort Clatsop. On the 23rd of March, the return trip begins. Now, originally, the plan was, if possible, to contact the crew of a vessel on the West Coast and present Jefferson's letter of credit, guaranteeing to the captain that the trip to the East Coast would be profitable. During their months wintering here on the shores of the Pacific Northwest, the Corps has yet to spot a vessel, and plans are now made for an overland return journey. A sea voyage may have been easier, but there's no guarantee that it would have been faster. Now, and for the next century, any voyage from the west to east coast of America has to make it all the way around the southernmost point of South America, and with favorable weather, the trip could still take a half of a year. Back in the United States on March 28th, Washington College is chartered by the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and in the modern day we know this as Washington and Jefferson College. The next day, March 29th, construction is authorized of the National Road, the first United States federal highway. This 66-foot-wide road is set to go from Cumberland to the state of Ohio, though this first leg won't be completed for some 12 years. Now, in April, a man by the name of Noah Webster publishes a reference book entitled A Compendious Dictionary of the English Language, and this first ever American dictionary contains the brief definitions for roughly 37,000 words, some of which are either spelled differently to the book's British counterparts, such as the word color being spelled C-O-L-O-R rather than C-O-L-O-U-R, and music spelled M-U-S-I-C instead of M-U-S-I-C-K, but it also contains words that the British have no need for yet, such as caucus, lacrosse, raccoon, skunk, squash, and tomahawk. In total, there are some 5,000 words or spelling variations not found in even the most complete British dictionaries of the time. Now, on to one story that's going to have massive repercussions as we continue our story. On April 18th, the United States Congress passes the Non-Importation Act, a calculated attempt to use economic leverage against Great Britain in response to the ongoing practice of impressment. American sailors are being captured and forced to work aboard British warships. Obviously, a massive challenge to American sovereignty. This hostility is not guided purely out of malice, as Britain is in a nearly existential battle with France. This Non-Importation Act emerges after months of growing outrage over the British actions. Royal Navy captains have intercepted American merchant vessels, claiming the right to search them for supposed British deserters. In practice, this often meant seizing any English-speaking sailors that they encountered, whether or not those men have ever served in the British fleet, and these actions are, obviously, deeply resented by the American public, who see them both as an insult to national honor and a threat to the country's independence. The United States government, however, has to weigh its reaction carefully. There's no appetite for immediate war, and the American Navy is tiny compared to the British. It's because of the relative weakness compared to Britain's global power that Congress turns to an economic measure as an alternative to any military engagement. Over the course of 3 months, legislators have fiercely debated their options, some members calling for a sweeping embargo against Britain, arguing that the complete cessation of trade would force British merchants to pressure their own government into changing course. Others point out that such a drastic step would have massive repercussions on the American economy, particularly in the shipping and export industries that are already vulnerable to disruptions in Atlantic commerce. The eventual compromise is this Non-Importation Act. It's a targeted measure to prohibit the importation of certain British-manufactured goods, focusing on luxury items and finished products that are not strictly essential to the American economy. The idea is still to apply enough economic pressure to Britain to make them reconsider their maritime policies, while limiting the damage to everyday Americans and merchants. This act is scheduled to take effect on November 15th of this year, giving American importers time to adjust their business operations to this still sweeping change. Now, as we'll see in coming years, this act doesn't exactly do what it is intended to. We now arrive at the story of the first of 3 signers who pass away this year. Robert Morris was born in 1734 in Liverpool, England. But his father, also Robert Morris, moved without the young Robert to America in 1938 after the death of the Morris family matriarch 2 years prior. The younger Robert joined his father in America at age 14, but 2 years later, in 1750, Robert Morris Sr. gave a dinner party on board one of the ships of his company, and as he was leaving the ship in a small boat, a farewell salute was fired from the ship and damaged the boat that he was in, severely injuring him. As a result of this fluke accident, he died of blood poisoning and left the younger Morris alone, without a family, at the age of 16, in a new continent. In his 20s, Morris took some of his earnings and joined a few friends in creating the London Coffee House, an institution which the Philadelphia Stock Exchange claims as its origin. During the 7 Years' War, Robert was sent as a ship captain on a trading mission to Jamaica, where he was captured by French privateers. Fortunately for him, however, and for the future of America, he was able to escape and take refuge in Cuba. Eventually, an American ship arrived in Havana, and he was able to use that to return home to Philadelphia. In 1965, the Stamp Act was passed, and Morris led a street protest, part of a broader movement that led to the local tax collector ceasing enforcement. And in 1769, Morris helped to organize the first non-importation agreement, which ended the slave trade in the Philadelphia region. That same year, Morris started his own family when he married Mary White, and the couple soon has 7 children. Morris was asked to be a warden of the Port of Philadelphia, And from this position in 75, he was able to convince the captain of the tea-ship Polly to return to England to avoid a more extreme response, such as an American Tea Party. After the war began at Lexington and Concord, Morris Company brought in weapons and powder for the militia, while his shipping contacts sent him information about English troop movements. So many supplies came into Morris Wharf that Congress actually had guards posted there at night to protect this valuable port of entry. Robert became increasingly active in the Patriot cause and served with Franklin on the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety, eventually becoming its chairman. Later, he was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly and then to the Second Continental Congress. While serving in Congress, he did not wish to separate from England outright because he thought Americans were not ready for self-rule and he feared anarchy would result. He was, of course, also concerned that the Americans were not really prepared for a war with the superpower of the day. He argued for a peaceful resolution, speaking out against independence, and rather famously, when the vote for independence was taken on July 2nd, Morris left the room so that it could pass without his dissenting vote. Now, there is some disagreement among scholars whether Morris was present on July 4th when the Declaration of Independence was approved. But what we know for sure is that when it came time to sign the Declaration on August 2nd, he joined his countrymen in doing so, recognizing the value of a unanimous front. He said at that time that it was the duty of every individual to act his part in whatever station his country may call him to in hours of difficulty, danger, and distress. From that moment forward, Morris backed the cause unflinchingly. Morris supplied Washington's army with financial aid, weapons, and blankets, while also communicating with American agents in France and getting the ships safely to sea. He sold his best ship to the Continental Navy, and it was renamed the Alfred, and sold a second one which became the Columbus. He later sold a third, which was renamed Reprisal, and that was the ship that took Franklin to France. Morris was one of the 16 signers of the Declaration to also sign the Articles of Confederation in York, and after the war, Morris had become a strong advocate of a more powerful government and attended the Annapolis Convention in '86 to discuss amending the Articles, and he hosted George Washington as they both attended the convention. It was Morris who first nominated Washington to be chairman, and of course Morris signed the new U.S. Constitution, one of only 2 signers of the Declaration to sign all 3 basic founding documents, the Declaration, the Articles, and the Constitution. After ratification of the Constitution, Morris was elected to be a representative for Pennsylvania in the Senate, and when Washington became president, George Washington invited Morris to become his Secretary of the Treasury. Morris, however, declined to serve, but recommended his friend, Alexander Hamilton, for the post, a suggestion that was well received and ever so highly influential. In the latter half of the 1790s, Morris diversified his business ventures, at one point it being said that he owned half of New York State, as well as owning a steam engine company, a glass factory, an iron mill, a coal company, and several canal companies. Though eventually he faces legal and financial troubles that cause him a great amount of stress. On the 8th of May this year, Robert Morris dies from his chronic asthma and is buried at Christ Church in Philadelphia. On May 30th, a man we have not yet met by the name of Andrew Jackson fights the second duel of his life, this time against a man by the name of Charles Dickinson, who, as the story goes, accused Jackson's wife of bigamy and reportedly called Jackson a worthless scoundrel, a poltroon, and a coward. Unlike the first duel in Jackson's life, in which he and Avery Waitstill fired into the air, Dickinson draws and fires first, the bullet narrowly missing Jackson's heart, and lodging in his breastbone. Dickinson, then, following the honor code of duels, stands still, crossing his arms and allowing Jackson an aimed shot, which lands in his lower abdomen, leading to a painful death later in the day. Jackson's reputation takes a hit for some time, but one more lasting effect from this duel is that he has a bullet lodged in his chest for the remainder of his life, slowly lead poisoning him and causing considerable pain. As a fun little bonus, I have posted a reading of the 26 Commandments of Dueling, or Code Duello, on our YouTube and Rumble, and included the document on our X today if you want to dig a little deeper into this old practice of men shooting each other to protect one's honor. Before we continue with the Corps of Discovery, who's currently camped out at the Nez Perce village, we'll recount the life of George Wythe, as it may be a bit confusing to only refer to him as his last name. I'll be calling him George throughout this account of his life. Before I began researching this whole show, I was definitely a novice when it comes to understanding all the minutiae of American history, and I had never heard the name George Wythe, at least as much as I can recall, but his life is a fascinating one, so here we go. George Wythe was born in Elizabeth County, Virginia in 1726. When George was 14, he entered the grammar school at William and Mary College. After 2 years there, he chose to follow the law, and in 46, at the age of 20, he rode to Williamsburg and presented himself for the examination and admittance to the bar. George passed the bar exam easily and received his license to practice law on June 18th in 46, and in 48 he was selected to serve as the clerk of 2 important standing committees in the House of Burgesses, the Privileges and Elections Committee, and the Propositions and Grievances Committee. His duties as clerk consisted of taking and presenting the minutes of the committee meetings. George's talents and connections allowed his law and political life to prosper, and he was appointed as the king's attorney in 1754. But he served in that role for only a few months, as the House of Burgesses selected George to fill the vacancy in the House. George failed to win re-election to the House of Burgesses twice, but in 1758 he was chosen by the faculty of the College of William and Mary as their representative to the House. In 63, George and Patrick Henry argued against a controversial tax called the Two-Penny Act, saying that the Crown had no business meddling in Virginia's local laws. When news of the hated Stamp Act reached Virginia in 64, George composed a letter of admonishment to Parliament. When Patrick Henry proposed incendiary resolutions denouncing the Stamp Act, George and others opposed him on the grounds that they had not yet received a response to their letter from Parliament, but Henry's resolutions passed anyway, and Governor Fauquier promptly dissolved the General Assembly. In 68, George became mayor of Williamsburg, a clear indication of his growing stature and popularity. When the Earl of Dunmore became governor, he and George often clashed, and George became increasingly estranged from the Royalist cause and became a firm supporter of the colony's rights to self-government. George Wythe traveled to Philadelphia in August of 75 to take his place as one of the Virginia delegates in the First Continental Congress, and during the continuing debate over independence, he asked his fellow delegates, "In what character shall we treat? As subjects of Great Britain? As rebels? Why should we be so fond of calling ourselves dutiful subjects? We must declare ourselves a free people." In the spring, he returned to the Virginia Convention to argue in favor of Jefferson's plan of government for a free and independent Virginia. He returned to Congress and signed the Declaration in September of 76, one of the few men not to sign in August. One of his final major achievements in Congress was to appoint Jefferson, Franklin, and Silas Deane as the colonial agents in France, the first ambassadors of what would go on to become the United States of America. George returned to Williamsburg in 77, where he was elected Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates and assisted Governor Patrick Henry in ensuring that Virginia met its obligations to the Continental Army's war effort. He remained at his home in Williamsburg during the remainder of the war, dangerously exposed at times to capture. In 77, George was appointed a justice of the state's highest court, and he serves in that capacity for 11 years. After Jefferson became governor in 79, Jefferson and James Madison, the president of William and Mary College, created a new chair of law and police, establishing the first college law curriculum in America. The man that they appointed as professor of this new department was none other than George Wythe, who held classes in the Wren Building or empty courtrooms in the old Capitol Building. He had his students participate in mock legislative sessions to gain experience in parliamentary procedures, as well as the art of debating. Some of his more famous law students over the years were Henry Clay, who would become the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Littleton Tazewell, who would become the governor of Virginia and a U.S. Senator, James Monroe, who obviously was a future president, and John Marshall, the future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who's come up a lot in some previous episodes. Interestingly, John Marshall's 6 weeks with George Wythe were the only legal training that he ever received. George Wythe intersects with history a few more times, as in 1781, on the way to the Siege of Yorktown, General Washington stayed with George and his wife Elizabeth in their Williamsburg home. Following the war, George spent much of his time working with others to convert the Confederation of States into a working constitution. He was a delegate to the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 87, but he rushed home after receiving word that his wife, Elizabeth, was seriously ill. I'm sure that he was glad he did because she died on August 18th of 87, but George still got to participate in the Constitution as he represented Williamsburg in the Virginia Convention called to ratify. Throughout the summer of 88, he served as chairman of the Committee to the Whole, guiding discussions and debates, eventually leading to the approval of it. After George resigned from William and Mary College, he served as an elector in the Electoral College and cast votes for Jefferson in both 1800 and in 1804. This very full and influential life brings us to today, June 6th of 1806, where George Wythe dies at 80 years of age and is buried in the churchyard of St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond, the same church where many years before, Patrick Henry delivered his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. 4 days after his passing, the Richmond Enquirer writes on their June 10th edition, "Kings may require mausoleums to consecrate their memory. Saints may claim the privilege of canonization, but the venerable George Wythe needs no other monument than the services rendered to his country and the universal sorrow that the country sheds over his grave." All right, now back to the Corps of Discovery. A small party from the Corps follows the Columbia River upstream and eventually brings back some pack horses to carry the Corps' gear until they can reach the Nez Perce to retrieve their horses. It's with the Nez Perce that the Corps will set up camp and wait for the snow to melt. By day, Lewis and Clark's men and the Indians compete in foot races and play boyhood games like prison base, and by night, they stay up late dancing and playing the fiddle around the fire. Lewis writes on the 8th of June, "One of the Indians informed us that we could not pass the mountains until the full of the next moon or about the 1st of July. That if we attempted it sooner, our horses would be at least 3 days' travel without food on the top of the mountain. This information is disagreeable insomuch as it causes some doubt as to the time at which it will be most proper for us to set out. However, as we have no time to lose, we will risk the chances and set out as early as the Indians generally think it practicable, or the middle of this month. On the 25th of June, they're out, and Lewis again writes, "Last evening, the Indians entertained us with setting the fir trees on fire. They have a great number of dry limbs near their bodies, which, when set on fire, creates a very sudden and immense blaze from bottom to top of those tall trees. They are a beautiful object in this situation at night. This exhibition reminded me of a display of fireworks. The natives told us that their object in setting those trees on fire was to bring fair weather for our journey. We collected our horses readily and set out at an early hour this morning. One of our guides complained of being unwell, a symptom which I did not much like, as such complaints with an Indian is generally the prelude to his abandoning any enterprise with which he is not well pleased. We left them at our encampment and they promised to pursue us in a few hours." The next day, he records the journey over the mountains. "The Indians hastened to be off and informed us that it was a considerable distance to the place which they wished to reach this evening, where there was grass for our horses. Accordingly, we set out with our guides, who led us over and along the steep sides of tremendous mountains entirely covered with snow, except about the roots of the trees where the snow had sometimes melted and exposed a few square feet of earth. We ascended and descended several lofty and steep heights, but keeping on the dividing ridge between the Chapunish and Kuskuski rivers, we passed no stream of water. Late in the evening, much to the satisfaction of ourselves and the comfort of our horses, we arrived at the desired spot and encamped on the steep side of a mountain, convenient to a good spring. It's now June 30th, and Lewis writes, "A little before sunset, we arrived at our old encampment on the south side of the creek, a little above its entrance into Clark's River. Here, we encamped with a view to remain 2 days in order to rest ourselves and horses and make our final arrangements for separation. As a voyage home has already been ruled out and they're now on the return trip, it's decided to make the most of this expedition, and on July 3rd, the Corps splits and Clark leads a group to explore the Yellowstone River, while Lewis takes another up the Marias River, which includes the northernmost edge of the Louisiana Territory. They, of course, have no way to communicate with each other as they're separated, so they plan to reunite at Fort Mandan. Back in the United States, on July 7th, the cornerstone is laid for America's first cathedral, now known as the Baltimore Basilica. The architect of this cathedral is Benjamin Latrobe, who has already lent his hand to the design of the original U.S. Capitol building. It's now time for us to pause for a moment and remember James Smith, who was born in Northern Ireland in 1719. His family immigrated to America, where they settled in Chester County, Pennsylvania in 1727, and he went on to become a surveyor in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. He also read law under his brother George and in the office of Thomas Cookson in Lancaster. James Smith was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1745 and began a practice in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, later moving to York. At the age of 41, he married Eleanor Armour in Newcastle, Delaware, and they had 5 children before she died, but of these 5 children, only one, Mary Smith, survived into adulthood. As James Smith's legal business grew, his surveying activities kind of took the back seat, but it did serve as an excellent background to understand the transfer of real estate from one owner to another and land record descriptions. Around the early 1760s, Smith began an iron foundry, and despite the nominative determinism, the business did not prosper. Not because there was no market for iron, as there absolutely was, but he had placed the enterprise in the hands of 2 partners who were, as Smith later recalled, a knave and a fool. So Smith lost a good bit of money on this venture, but was still becoming widely known in the area, and by the early 1770s he was pretty concerned about the widening rift between the colonists and Britain. He attended a provincial assembly in 74 where he offered a paper he had written entitled Essay on the Constitutional Power of Great Britain over the Colonies in America, and in that paper, Smith recommended that the colonies boycott all British goods, feeling that targeting British wallets would force Parliament to back away from some of their most oppressive laws. That move is exactly what transpired, of course, as the First Continental Congress adjourned in Philadelphia in the fall of 74. It was at this time that James Smith organized a volunteer company of militia in York County, and the volunteers quickly elected him as captain. As tensions continued to escalate between the colonies and the British, the militia company soon grew to a battalion size. Smith was elected a delegate to the state convention in Philadelphia in January of 75, and he concurred in the spirited declaration of that convention that if the British administration should determine by force to effect a submission to the late arbitrary acts of the British Parliament, in such a situation, we hold it our indispensable duty to resist such force, and at every hazard to defend the rights and liberties of America. While serving in the state assembly, Smith made a greater name for himself as a supporter of the causes of American freedom, and of course it became increasingly evident that the only course towards freedom was through separation. Smith joined in signing the engrossed declaration in the summer of 76, though after the war he largely stayed out of politics, instead resuming his practice of law in York until 1800, when he retired at the age of 81, said to be the oldest lawyer in Pennsylvania at the time. Now, July of 1806, Smith passes away and is interred at the First Presbyterian Churchyard. Reflecting the fact that not much is recorded of his life, not much is written on his marble gravestone, it simply being inscribed, James Smith, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, died July 11, 1806, aged 93 years old. Now, I'm not exactly sure why it claims his age is 93, as he was born in 1719 and would be 86 years old, as he's not past his birthday this year. I haven't been able to find any records that conflate his birthday or any writings in which Smith claims to be older than he is, but there you go. A lot of records from this time are pretty hard to keep track of, and especially when moving country, different records that may normally stay with the family are easy to lose. But if I'm missing something, I'd love for you to reach out and tell me why there's this discrepancy. Also in July, we begin the story of a man we mentioned at the end of yesterday's episode, Zebulon Pike. Pike was more of a professional military man than either Lewis or Clark, and he was a smart man who had taught himself Spanish, French, mathematics, and elementary science. When the governor of Louisiana Territory requested a military expedition to explore the headwaters of the Mississippi, General James Wilkinson picked Pike to lead it, which he did during the late winter, erroneously claiming to have found the Mississippi headwaters. Although Pike's first Western expedition was only moderately successful, like we said at the end of yesterday's episode, Wilkinson picks him to lead a second mission in July of this year to explore the headwaters of the Red and Arkansas rivers. He sets out from St. Louis with a party of 22 men with orders to locate and explore the headwaters, and his plan is to ascend the Arkansas River, cross over to the Red River, and then descend that river to its junction with the Mississippi. Now, after the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, the boundary line between its territories and the Spanish Empire in the southwest was undetermined. The Spanish were naturally prepared to resist any attempts by the United States to encroach on land they felt they had a claim to. The further west that Pike moves, the more likely he is to encounter trouble, as the Spanish furiously try to protect their northern borderlands, though Pike's first concern is to negotiate a peace between the Osage and Pawnee tribes, and Pike ascends the Missouri and Osage rivers to the Osage villages, where he obtains horses, then moves on to the Pawnee villages on the Republican River. It's there that he finds the Pawnees are ready to resist further American advances to the west because they have already been visited by a more impressive Spanish expedition that had been sent out to defend Spain's northern borders from the U.S. While it doesn't seem likely that the Indians knew to expect Pike's party, higher-ranking Spanish officials have definitely been informed of the Pike expedition by an American known as Special Agent Number 13 for the Spanish Intelligence Service. We'll catch back up with Pike's expedition later in the year as he continues to move further west and gain in elevation. At the end of this busy July, we return to the Corps of Discovery, where on July 25th, Clark etches his name and the date into a sandstone outcropping near what is modern-day Billings, Montana. He names the outcropping Pompey's Tower after Sacagawea's son, and it remains a rare physical evidence of Lewis and Clark's expedition that survives to this day. The very next day, but miles away, Lewis' party is met by a small band of Blackfeet warriors in Montana. After camping together overnight, Lewis catches the Blackfeet trying to steal their guns and horses, but it's an interesting story. I'd rather hear it from Lewis himself. This morning at daylight, the Indians got up and crowded around the fire. Jay Fields, who was on post, had carelessly laid his gun down behind him, near where his brother was sleeping. One of the Indians, the fellow to whom I had given the medal last evening, slipped behind him and took his gun and that of his brother's, unperceived by him. At the same instant, 2 others advanced and seized the guns of Drewer and myself. Jay Fields, seeing this, turned about to look for his gun and saw the fellow just running off with her and his brothers. He called out to his brother, who instantly jumped up and pursued the Indian, with whom they overtook at the distance of 50 or 60 paces from the camp, seized their guns, and wrested them from him, and R. Fields, as he seized his gun, stabbed the Indian in the heart with his knife. The fellow ran about 15 steps and fell dead. Of this I did not know until afterwards. Having recovered their guns, they ran back instantly to the camp. Drewer, who was awake, saw the Indian take hold of his gun and instantly jumped up and seized her and wrested her from him, but the Indian still retained his pouch. His jumping up and crying, "Damn you, let go my gun!" awakened me. I jumped up and asked, "What's the matter?" which I quickly learned when I saw Dreyer in a scuffle with the Indian for his gun. I reached to seize my gun, but found her gone. I then drew a pistol from my holster, and tearing myself about, saw the Indian making off with my gun. I ran at him with my pistol and bid him lay down my gun, which he was in the act of doing when the Fieldsies returned and drew up their guns to shoot him, which I forbid, as he did not appear to be about to make any resistance or commit any offensive act. He dropped the gun and walked slowly off. I picked her up instantly. Dreyer, having about this time recovered his gun and pouch, asked me if he might not kill the fellow, which I also forbid, as the Indian did not appear to wish to kill us. As soon as they found us all in possession of our arms, they ran and endeavored to drive off all the horses. I now hallooed to the men and told them to fire on them if they attempted to drive off our horses. They accordingly pursued the main party who were driving the horses up the river, and I pursued the man who had taken my gun, who, with another, was driving off a part of the horses which were to the left of the camp. I pursued them so closely that they could not take 12 of their own horses, but continued to drive one of mine with some others. At the distance of 300 paces, they entered one of those steep niches in the bluff with the horses before them. Being nearly out of breath, I could pursue no further. I called to them as I had done several times before. that I would shoot them if they did not give me my horse, and raised my gun. One of them jumped behind a rock and spoke to the other, who turned around and stopped at the distance of 30 steps from me, and I shot him through the belly. He fell to his knees and on his right elbow, from which position he partially raised himself up and fired at me, and turning himself about, crawled in behind a rock which was a few feet from him. He overshot me. Being bareheaded, I felt the wind of his bullet very distinctly. Not having my shot pouch, I could not reload my piece, and there were 2 of them behind good shelters from me. I did not think it prudent to rush on them with my pistol, which I had discharged. I had not the means of reloading until I reached camp. I, therefore, returned leisurely towards camp. It is the only time an Indian is killed on the whole of the expedition, and Lewis is so concerned that the Blackfeet will come after his men that they jump on their horses and ride for nearly 24 hours straight to get down to the Missouri River, where they'll eventually meet with the rest of their party. On the 29th, Lewis and Clark's parties are about 300 miles apart, and both experience the moment differently. Lewis writes, "Shortly after dark last evening, a violent storm came from the northwest, attended with rain, hail, thunder, and lightning, which continued the greater part of the night. Not having the means of making a shelter, I lay in the water all night. The rain continued, with but little intermission all day. I intend halting as soon as the weather proves fair, in order to dry our baggage, which much wants it." Whereas Clark writes, "A slight rain last night with hard thunder and sharp lightning, accompanied with a violent northeast wind. I set out early this morning, wind so hard ahead that we made but little way. Throughout the journey thus far there has been close calls, especially for Lewis, with injury, yet he's always managed to avoid any serious injuries. On August 11th, the 2 parties are soon to reunite after over a month exploring different routes. Lewis suffers his worst injury of the trip, though not one bad enough to keep him from writing in his journal. Just opposite the burnt hills, there happened to be a herd of elk on Thick Willow Bar, and finding that my observation was lost for the present, I determined to land and kill some of them. Accordingly, we put to, and I went out with Cruzat only. We fired on the elk. I killed one, and he wounded another. We reloaded our guns and took different routes through the thick willows in pursuit of the elk. I was in the act of firing on the elk a second time when a ball struck my left thigh about an inch below my hip joint, missing the bone. It passed through the left thigh and cut the thickness of the bullet across the hinder part of my right thigh. The stroke was very severe. I instantly supposed that Cruzat had shot me in mistake for an elk, as I was dressed in brown leather, and he cannot see very well. Under this impression, I called out to him, "Damn you! You have shot me!" and looked toward the place from whence the ball had come. Seeing nothing, I called Cruzat several times as loud as I could, but received no answer. I was now persuaded that it was an Indian that had shot me, as the report of the gun did not appear to be more than 40 paces from me, and Cruzat appeared to be out of hearing me. In this situation, not knowing how many Indians there might be concealed in the bushes, I thought best to make good my retreat to the pirogue, calling out as I ran for the first 100 paces as loud as I could to Cruzat to retreat, hoping to alarm him in time to make his escape also. I still retained the charge in my gun, which I was about to discharge at the moment the ball struck me. When I arrived in sight of the pirogue, I called the men to their arms, to which they flew in an instant. I told them that I was wounded, but I hoped not mortally, by an Indian, I believed, and directed them to follow me, that I would return and give them battle and relieve Cruzat if possible, who I feared had fallen into their hands. The men followed me as they were bid, and I returned about 100 paces when my wounds became so painful and my thigh so stiff that I could scarcely get on. In short, I was compelled to halt and ordered the men to proceed, and if they found themselves overpowered by numbers, to retreat in order, keeping up a fire. I now got back to the pirogue as well as I could and prepared myself with a pistol, my rifle, and air gun, being determined, as a retreat was impracticable, to sell my life as dearly as possible. In this state of anxiety and suspense, remained about 20 minutes when the party returned with Cruzat and reported that there were no Indians nor the appearance of any. Cruzat seemed much alarmed and declared if he had shot me, it was not his intention. That he had shot an elk in the willows after he left or separated from me. I asked him whether he did not hear me when I called to him so frequently, which he absolutely denied. I do not believe that the fellow did it intentionally, but after finding that he had shot me was anxious to conceal his knowledge of having done so. The ball had lodged in my breeches, which I knew to be the ball of the short rifles such as that he had. And there being no person out with me but him, and no Indians that we could discover, I have no doubt in my mind of him having shot me. With the assistance of Sergeant Gass, I took off my clothes and dressed my wounds myself as well as I could, introducing tents of patient lint into the ball holes. The wounds bled considerably, but I was happy to find that it had touched neither bone nor artery. I sent the men to dress the 2 elk which Cruzat and myself had killed, which they did in a few minutes, and brought the meat to the river. The small canoes came up shortly after with the flesh of 1 elk. My wounds being so situated that I could not without infinite pain make an observation, I determined to relinquish it and proceed on. We came within 8 miles of our encampment of the 15th of April 1805, and encamped on the northeast side. As it was painful to me to be removed, I slipped on board the pirogue. The pain I experienced excited a high fever, and I had a very uncomfortable night. On August 12th, the 2 parties near each other, with Clark's party slightly ahead of that of Lewis. Lewis writes, "Being anxious to overtake Captain Clark, who, from the appearance of his camps, could be at no great distance before me, we set out early and proceeded with all possible expedition. At 8 a.m., the bowsman informed me that there was a canoe in a camp he believed of white men on the northeast shore. I directed the pirogue and canoes to come to at this place and found it to be the camp of 2 hunters from the Illinois, by name Joseph Dickinson and Forrest Hancock. These men informed me that Captain Clark had passed them about noon the day before." Now, by evening, the 2 parties reconnect, and Lewis says that he's happy to find them all well, but that as writing in his present state is extremely painful, he wants to hand over the writing duties to Captain Clark. Picking up from Clark, we hear about the remainder of the day. "I was alarmed on the landing of the canoes to be informed that Captain Lewis was wounded by an accident. I found him laying in the pirogue. He informed me that his wound was slight and would be well in 20 or 30 days. This information relieved me very much. I examined the wound and found it a very bad flesh wound. The ball had passed through the fleshy part of his left thigh, below the hip bone, and cut the cheek of the right buttock for 3 inches in length and the depth of the ball. Captain Lewis informed me the accident happened the day before by one of the men, Peter Cruzat, mistaking him in the thick bushes to be an elk. At 3 p.m. we proceeded on all together after having left the 2 leather canoes on the bank. A little below the entrance of Charbonneau's Creek, we came to on a large sand point from the southeast side and encamped. The wind blew very hard from the southwest, and some rain. I washed Captain Lewis' wound, which has become sore and somewhat painful to him. In our last update of Lewis and Clark's journey before they triumphantly returned to civilization, Clark writes on August 17th, "Cool morning. Gave some powder and ball to Big White Chief. Settled with Touchant Charbonneau for his services as an interpreter for the price of a horse, and lodge, purchased of him for public service, in all amounting to $500, 33 1/3 cents. Directed 2 of the largest canoes be fastened together with poles tied across them so as to make them sturdy for the purpose of conveying the Indians and interpreter and their families. We also took our leave of Touchant Charbonneau, his Snake Indian wife, and their son-child, who had accompanied us on our route to the Pacific Ocean in the capacity of interpreter and interpretess. Over a month after Lewis and Clark reunited at the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, and weeks after saying goodbye to Sacagawea and her husband at Fort Mandan, the Corps of Discovery arrives back in St. Louis, where the exhausted explorers are greeted as heroes. Lewis and Clark have their men fire off their weapons as a salute to the town, and the villagers run out to give the men a hearty welcome. Lewis doesn't update his journal, but instead writes to President Jefferson saying, "It is with pleasure that I announce to you the safe arrival of myself and party at 12 today at this place with our papers and baggage. In obedience to your orders, we have penetrated the continent of North America to the Pacific Ocean and sufficiently explored the interior of the country to affirm with confidence that we have discovered the most practicable route which does exist across the continent by means of the navigable branches of the Missouri and Columbia rivers. The total distance from the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi to the discharge of the Columbia into the Pacific Ocean, 3,555 miles. The navigation of the Missouri may be deemed safe and good. Its difficulties arise from its falling banks, timber embedded in the mud of its channels, its sandbars and steady rapidity of its current, all which may be overcome with a great degree of certainty by taking the necessary precautions. If the government will only aid, even in a very limited manner, the enterprise of her citizens, I am fully convinced that we shall shortly derive the benefits of a most lucrative trade from this source, and that in the course of 10 or 12 years, a tour across the continent by the route mentioned will be undertaken by individuals with as little concern as a voyage across the Atlantic is at present. As I shall shortly be with you, I have deemed it unnecessary here to detail the several ideas which have presented themselves to my mind on those subjects, more especially when I consider that a thorough knowledge of the geography of the country is absolutely necessary to their being understood, and leisure has not yet permitted us to make but one general map of the country which I am unwilling to risk by the mail. I have brought with me several skins of the sea otter, 2 skins of the native sheep of America, 5 skins and skeletons complete of the bighorn or mountain ram, and a skin of the mule deer, besides the skins of several other quadrupeds and birds native of the countries through which we have passed. I have also preserved a pretty extensive collection of plants and collected 9 other vocabularies. With respect to the exertions and services rendered by that estimable man Captain William Clark in the course of late voyage, I cannot say too much. If, sir, any credit be due for the success of that arduous enterprise in which we have been mutually engaged, he is equally with myself entitled to your consideration and that of our common country. So there we have it. The now iconic journey of Lewis and Clark has come to a close, and everybody's made it back safe and sound. That singular map that Lewis was referring to there was made by William Clark, as he was the expedition's primary cartographer, and you can check out a photo of that on our X today. Less than 1 month after Lewis writes this letter to Jefferson, General James Wilkinson also writes to the president with a bombshell report. You'll remember that James Wilkinson is the man who sent Pike on the expedition, which is the next story that we are about to wrap up for this year. But for now, in this letter to the president, he alleges a plot monumental in scope that is currently underway and that could destabilize the United States' claim to Louisiana. He says, "Sir, whatever may be the general impropriety, I persuade myself that on a subject irrelative to my official obligations, I shall be excused for addressing you directly and confidentially. But I have another and more cogent reason for deviating, in this instance, from the ordinary course of my correspondence. It is possible the momentous occasion of this letter and the vital importance attached to it may have excited solicitudes to beguile my understanding and elude my judgment, and in such case I trust the integrity of the intention will secure me your confidence, and that this letter, with the communication it covers, may find their graves in your breast. For although my information appears too direct and circumstantial to be fictitious, yet the magnitude of the enterprise, the desperation of the plan, and the stupendous consequences with which it seems pregnant stagger my belief and excite doubts of the reality against the conviction of my senses. And it is for this reason I shall forbear to commit names, because it is my desire to avert a great public calamity, and not to mar a salutary design or to injure anyone undeservedly. I have never, in my whole life, found myself in such circumstances of perplexity and embarrassment as at present, for I am not only uninformed of the prime mover and ultimate objects of this daring enterprise, but am ignorant of the foundation on which it rests, of the means by which it is to be supported, and whether any immediate or collateral protection, internal or external, is expected. The following information appears to rest on such broad and explicit grounds as to exclude all doubts of its authenticity. A numerous and powerful association extending from New York through the western states to the territories bordering on the Mississippi has been formed with the very design to levy and rendezvous 8,000 or 10,000 men in New Orleans at a very near period, and from thence, with the cooperation of a naval armament, to carry on an expedition against Vera Cruz. Agents from Mexico, who were in Philadelphia the beginning of August, are engaged in this enterprise. Those persons have given assurances that the landing of the proposed expedition will be seconded by so general an insurrection as to ensure the subversion of the present government and silence all opposition in 3 or 4 weeks. It is unknown under what authority this enterprise has been projected, from whence the means of its supports are derived, or what may be the intentions of its leaders in relation to the territory of Orleans, but it is believed that the maritime cooperation will depend on a British squadron from the West Indies, under the ostensible command of American masters. So, Wilkinson alleges a plot is currently underway in which agents from Mexico, the British, and American traders are conspiring together to seize southwestern lands from the U.S. government. How will Jefferson respond? Who's involved? Well, we'll cover this in 1807 on Monday, and it's a fascinating tale of double crosses, secrecy, and hidden intentions. For our final story of this year, we'll catch back up with Zebulon Pike and his men, who are currently traveling through the high plains, a dry and largely empty swath of the country filled with little besides muddy rivers, never-ending grasslands, and sporadic appearances of wind-blown rock formations. It has been weeks of traveling across rivers and plains when Pike first sees a massive peak on the horizon. I'll pause really briefly here and include a personal anecdote, which is atypical for the show and something you should not get used to. Some years ago, me and my wife made the journey west to live in what is now Colorado Springs, and our journey toward the Front Range was the first time we had ever seen the state, let alone the Rocky Mountains. We drove for days across the plains, averaging 60 miles an hour, a speed Pike could never have dreamed of, and did so with air conditioning, suspension, an abundance of easily obtained food, and Google Maps. Still, it felt like an undertaking, and when we turned west after driving for some time north, at the intersection of 71 and 94 in a small town called Pumpkin Center, we first caught a glimpse of what my wife thought was a cloud on the horizon. It was hazy, and the sun near perfectly overhead caused all the distant details to appear washed out and light. I myself had never seen this area, and as we pulled over to peer into the distance, I questioned if my instinct was right, that what we were looking at was, instead, a far distant mountain. I said I believed that foggy shape was actually our destination, and was answered with disbelief that from such a flat expanse that we had spent the better part of the morning traveling across, there could possibly be such a massive step up. But as we continued our travel west, the object of our speculation only became clearer, more imposing, and its beauty more obvious. We had in fact spotted a 14,000-foot tall mountain on the horizon, a mountain that today has a paved road going all the way to the top of its highest heights, a mountain which today, with all the modern conveniences afforded to sightseers, is the most visited mountain peak in the entirety of the United States. What we had spotted on that summer day, while some 70 miles away, is a mountain that today bears the subject of our current story's name, Pike's Peak. 215 years before we traveled to the area on a paved highway, Pike arrived in nearly the same place, blazing the trail for hundreds of thousands he'd, of course, never know the names of. On November 15th of 1806, he sees this distant apparition, and he grossly underestimates the height and distance of the mountain, never having seen mountains the size of the Rockies himself. But as he and his group of explorers nears the mountain, he reportedly tells his men they should be able to walk up the peak, climb it, and return before dinner. The weather and the illusion caused by the land actually dipping before rising again to the 14,000-foot peak, largely to blame for this extreme miscalculation. Pike and his men struggle through snow and sub-zero temperatures before finally taking shelter in a cave for the night, without even having reached the base of the towering mountain. Pike later pronounces the peak impossible to scale, and, not to give too much away, he doesn't live long enough to be proven wrong. During the next 2 months, he explores the Colorado high country, reaching the site of present-day Leadville, while hunting in vain for the headwaters of the Red River. With several of the men in his band suffering from frostbite, Pike establishes a winter camp at the Royal Gorge on the Arkansas River, and there many of his men will stay until next year, while Pike and a smaller detachment of men continue to explore further west. But we'll pick this story up next time. Well, that's all I've got for 1806. That's another week down. I'm putting the call out. Get in contact with me if you're listening to the show every day. Tell me what it is that keeps you coming back, what you enjoy about it, what you don't. I want to hear all the feedback, so you can hit me up on X, on Instagram, on Gmail, anywhere that you can find 250 Years of USA. Go ahead and reach out and tell me what you think. There's obviously a lot of time that goes into this project, a lot of love, a lot of effort. It really means a lot when I hear any feedback at all, especially if it's positive. But that's all I got. Like I said, we'll see you on Monday with 1807 and wrap up some of these loose ends that I've been teasing pretty incessantly. This has been our story, 250 years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.